Okay. I mean, is this. Did I. Well, housekeeping. Huh. I mean, this is the third episode, episode 2. The last episode, episode 1, I referred to as episode 2, even though it was the second episode, making it episode 1, because the first episode was episode 0, because of how much of a travesty it was. People, it's all very clear and simple. Now, you're probably asking yourself, why was the last episode, episode 1, not the first episode, but the one purporting to be the first episode? Why did it sound like horse poo-poo? Did I accidentally forget to switch to my microphone and was using the microphone on my laptop the whole time? Yes. Does that make it painful to listen to? Yes. Am I going to redo it? No. Why? I don't care enough and am lazy. So, yeah, I wish I had a better answer, but I don't. So that's what it is. Also, I'm wearing headphones that are not actually monitors. This is part of it. This is part of the experience. Today's episode is God. God. We're solving all the universe's mysteries, all the problems. God, divinity, spirituality. Wonder no more. All your questions shall be answered. We're going to go, I don't know, maybe an hour. Roughly an hour. That's the aim. So, we've incrementally solved some of the problems. Baby steps. We're getting there. Last episode was cheat codes. We never talked about wormholes. So wormholes, God, basically the same thing. I mean, let's be real here. We may talk about wormholes at some point. I mean, it's kind of self-explanatory. What even needs to be said about wormholes? But the topic for the next hour that I'm going to try to stay relatively in the vein of is God as a cheat code, which I think is an interesting idea because as I discussed in the last episode, cheat codes really make sense, really are most meaningful as an idea within a system that codes, we could say it encodes some naturalistic phenomena, it systematizes things, and then within that system, you now have access to potentially some cheat codes. I think one of the ways of thinking about God is as a kind of a cheat code. And obviously no disrespect to anybody. I think I'm potentially, I mentioned this in the end of the last one, in our wind down and sign off teaser segment of the last episode, I discussed that potentially I'm alienating both sides of this. The religious people are like, how dare you conceptualize God, the supreme and ultimate, as a cheat code. That's like debasing God as blasphemy, And then on the other side, there's probably secular people who are like, you're legitimizing God, or whatever. You're reifying. Reifying? I don't know if that's the proper usage of the word. You're instantiating God as something that can't be because I don't believe in it. So we're going to walk that line. As I mentioned, I was raised in a very secular household, but had a spiritual awakening as an adult, which probably will be discussed another time. But part of the spiritual awakening was the realization that I got to be careful with my language here. In some sense, maybe I could say in a personal sense, just to be safe, the realness of God, which was always a sort of presupposed fact that God wasn't real, was actually sort of not, the way that I was thinking of it wasn't really useful or meaningful. Like, could we know in a reductive scientific sense anything about a God? No. So it's like, why would you even use that metric of comparison? So then it's like, well, is there any use for a word like God, or an idea, or the concept of God? And it's like, well, yeah, and you don't have to instantiate anything supernatural or, classically or externally divine. It's a useful idea. And so in what way is God a useful idea? And in what way is the idea of God potentially a sort of a cheat code? Well, one of the ways that maybe it was a couple of years ago, I sort of conceptualized it like this, of like, part of maybe a spiritual conception of God, at least for me, this is all personal, was a realization of like, maybe you could simplify it as like internal dialogue, of like the idea that I could ask a question of myself and get an answer. And what's interesting about that is that, if it's mental activity, and we suppose that mental activity is, mediated or originates in the brain, then essentially I'm having a conversation with myself, or my brain is having a conversation with itself. So maybe parts of the brain, or different, constructed identities within the brain. But what's unusual is that, like, I can imagine a conversation with two people, where these people in my imagination are sort of like puppets. Like, I'm acting out what each of them is saying. Like a kid playing with dolls or something. Like, hey, well, hey, honey, I'm home. Oh, how was your day at work? I'm the puppet master. I'm doing both sides of the conversation. Whereas there's a different sort of mental activity, which maybe is more aligned, especially with younger kids, of like an imaginary friend, of like, I don't imagine that I'm supplying the my conversation partner's perspective. I'm not talking for them. My experience is that I'm asking a question of an other, something identified as other, and then the other responds, but I don't have the experience that the response is me, that I'm doing the response. And one of the, I think sometimes it's considered like evidence or something, but one of the key features of this experience is that the other will respond in a way that is surprising, that I find humorous, that is unexpected, something I didn't know about or hadn't ever thought about before, that the other responds with information is seemingly convincing about information that I am not privy to, that I couldn't have access to, information that I can't verify, and has a sort of a independence and a sort of continuity about them, where they seem very much to be unfazed by my suspicions about their existence. It's like, well, okay, fine, think that, but I'm here. I don't know what to say. Like, I'm just answering. I'm not. This isn't a charade. Maybe there's something going on, but it's, I'm not tricking you. Which is a very unusual scene to be a part of within your own mind. To be like, wait a minute, you're me, and they're like, well, maybe in theory, but it's not that way on my end. And so, as part of this, I think this relates a little bit to like what I call like the puzzler's mindset of like solving a puzzle. But a puzzle, a good, well-crafted puzzle is designed to teach you what you need to know as you go. I mean, there are some puzzles which are intentionally very frustrating or whatever, with secrets that hide things. That's how some puzzles work. But I think especially like a good series of puzzles each step is just challenging enough, and it teaches you sort of what you need to know. But ultimately, maybe if we think about those puzzles where there's really only one step to solving the puzzle, and it's just thinking outside, like it's just some crazy there's no indication, no hint, no clue, no lead up. It's not trying to teach you anything. There's not some connection you're supposed to make. It's just totally, you got to throw everything at the wall and see what works. I was thinking maybe I would give you an example of like an actual puzzle, but it's not important. when we extend that, we can say, I think a great examples of puzzles like magic tricks, right? So you think about a magic trick, and you think about the effect, and then you think about the mechanism. And part of seeing a magic trick is seeing an effect, which you clearly saw. You saw some, usually visual effect, and you think to yourself, well, there's no sort of explanation. I can't conceive of how the trick would work, of how he managed to do that. Because, sometimes you'll see, like, a kid will do a magic trick, and it's like, well, it's obvious what happened, what had to have happened, how you did that. Even though you may not have flashed, you may not have shown it to me but just logic dictates what must have happened. But a well-constructed, a well-crafted trick by a serious magician, it's not obvious. It seems almost totally impossible based on how they've constructed it. Usually by fooling you at some point, where you think this is totally impossible. Because there's something you don't know about. There's some thing you haven't thought about. But a good magician, or a good skeptic who's studied a lot of magicians, which I would consider myself to be, they're a little more flexible in their thinking. And what's interesting is in the cascade of thoughts that the ordinary spectator goes through, that they, sort of most people want to, which is, oh my god, it couldn't have been this, it couldn't have been this. Oh my god, this dude is freaking magic. He vanished it. He passed it through it's whatever. And the skeptic is much more stalwart in I know the one thing he didn't do is use magic. So, if it can't have been any of these things, then somehow he must, this is the physical constraint. And even though I may not know any methods of doing that, there must be a method which abides to these rules. And if you're good, and unless you missed something significant, the ultimate solution fits exactly into that. Well, because it had to. He got from point A to point B. Oh god, there's a mathematical theorem, and it's like got some fancy name or something. But basically, it says like, if you're going from point A to point B, the slope of the direct line is the average slope of any curving path. So even if you wind and go backwards in whatever direction, doesn't matter. If you add up the angles at every single point, they will sum to the same as the angle of the straight line. And it's so obvious, like it's so stupid. Like, oh yeah, of course. For each step to the right I go, I'll have to take another step to the left to get back on the straight line. Like, obviously it'll sum to that. But I think it's an important, construct when we're breaking down a magic trick is like, well, it has to get from point A to point B. So by some measure, it must pass through the direct line. For each step that it deviates from the direct path, the straight line, it must then somehow correct. So you then have to sort of add in what are the potential correcting factors. Anyways, let's not go too far. Why were we talking about magician? Oh, because we're asking ourselves, eventually we're getting to this spiritual question, right? Imagine that you see a magician who is, for our intents and purposes, a genuine magician, has the powers of magic, and does your classic magic trick, whatever it is, a vanishing trick or whatever, passes an object through a solid object, who knows, but does it via magic. And so as the skeptic as a skeptic spectator, that's a good phrase, as a skeptic spectator, you watch it and you are thinking, well, what is the possible mechanism? What is the explanation? And at some point, God, who was it? Was it Penn and Teller? It was someone. Maybe it was even on a podcast or something. And someone was interviewing them and asking them, like, what's the ultimate trick? And they were talking about, or like, what's the secret to a good trick? Maybe it was Penn. And he was saying, like, a trick has to leave room for doubt. You can't have a trick that's too perfect. And he was saying, as an example, I think, there was a stage trick where there would be two doors on either end of a stage, and the magician would walk through one and reappear at the other. And he was saying something like that. And he was saying it's too perfect of a trick because the transition is instantaneous. And even though we want, as spectators, to see the magic and believe the magic, instantaneous travel without any energy signature, like without air moving or some sound, without any indication. A person can't travel instantly from one side of the stage to the other. So in your brain, you immediately go, well, okay, there must be two people. Like there must, maybe it's twins or maybe whatever, but it can't have actually just teleported, right? So in a trick, if there's going to be some teleportation, even if you could do it instantly, because, for example, let's say it's just a twin or something, you have to delay it a little bit. You have to make the trick a little bit worse, a little bit less magical, so that then the person can start mechanating in their own mind of like, well, maybe he went this way, maybe he did this, maybe he did this. Whereas all those possibilities are eliminated when it's instantaneous. So when you see the instantaneous trick, when you see the trick that not only defies understanding, but it defies, conservation of energy. I mean, it defies the laws of reality. Then you say, well, the solution, the way that this must have happened is must, by definition, be outside the laws of reality. So maybe it just looked like it happened instantly, but it didn't really. It was just an apparent illusion. Or, maybe God did it. Maybe there was something outside of, quote unquote, outside of the universe, outside of the ultimate constraining laws. So I think this is where a certain kind of useful godliness or divinity or something comes in, where it's like there are some questions, some problems, some situations which it's not only possible but easy for a limited incarnate human being to think about, which when you ask of your problem-solving apparatus, that part of your mind that deduces things, what is the solution? How do we explain this? What's the missing link? That the answer that it gives up is one that is outside of the system of, reductive laws. Because if there is an answer which exists within those laws, it's inaccessible. So the only way that this artifact of the mind is able to comprehend this is by, invoking a ultimate, or some unit, some element which is not constrained by the constraining principles, right? And so we could say, if there's a universal constraining principle that all entities composed of matter are bound by the laws of energy, of conservation of energy, whatever, then you say, well, I have this thing which is behaving in this way which isn't bound by the conservation of energy. Then you say, well, it must have some other essence, some other composition, some other form that allows it to exist and operate by different rules. Now, before we go too far, I think another important element is like, well, then how did it interact with us if it's unbeholden? We can't see God. In what way did we have access to it? Well, I saw it visually. Okay, well then, in theory, either something happened with light that caused, your retina to see it, or something happened in your brain that caused you to hallucinate, or to believe that you were seeing it, or whatever. So it's like, if this thing is in some way mysterious or transcendent or something, in what way did you have access to it? Was it just through knowing, through a thought experiment? Was it through some visual, illusion? Was it through some misapprehension? Whatever. So, because those, God, how do I want to say this? Those points at which it intersects with our reality and experience then may have to be, whether those are, the psychological internal reality, or whether those are a physical external reality, that those experiences of the divine may be constrained, those inputs and outputs, even if the ultimate reality of the divine is by definition or by principle unconstrained by those things. Anyways, we're getting a little bit far. So what this means is that God, or whatever you want to call it, the spiritual, the supernatural. Well, spiritual actually. Oopsies, yikes! Hit the microphone. Hello, that was just a little. See if you're paying attention. I think spirituality is a very interesting word that I want to think about a little bit later. I don't have necessarily the perfect word. In the past, I've referred to this as God, what did I say? I think it was like para-rational cognition or something. But yeah, I mean, it seems pretty trivial to, like, I mean, religious people, if you actually listen to them, which sometimes can be difficult, this is basically what they do. I mean, most religious, spiritual people who believe in, supernatural or whatever, divine things, they're pretty unsophisticated in there, Like, if you really are a true believer, there's no need to... not only is there no need to ground your beliefs in scientific principles or logic or rational thought, but you sort of actually demean and diminish the value of the divine when you try to ground it or justify it or explain it in terms of, rationality or logic. So I'm, definitely a big believer that if you're going to make an argument for the realness of, divinity, that you should not be trying to use logic or rational thought. But, when you listen to these people, that's all they do, is they go, well, the universe had to be created, so the creator is God. I mean, this is very simple logic, but maybe simple is good for us to work with. It's like, yeah, this is one of the ways of apprehending a meaningful definition. Like, what is God? Well, we can just say there are, when we're talking, we're communicating in language. Language is a system of categories and, discriminatory differentiations of meaning. So there is some label that we need to provide for, unknowable, inaccessible, ineffable things. And, why shouldn't, like, that, we have a label, we use the word God. So I think the big problem with talking about God is just, like, it's an infinite category, I think what I would argue is it's a very important category, which is something I think most secular people, most atheists, even most agnostics, are like, they don't believe it's a useful category. Where it's like, what are you talking about? Like, have you ever thought about anything interesting? Have you ever tried to, theorize a limit case? Like, what could be more useful? I think on the flip side, however, I don't want to say believers, but I think it's possible also to see too clearly the fact that the divine can, sort of transmute, especially psychologically, can sort of transmute reality, and you can sort of get addicted to God and to the fact that, it is sort of a cheat code, and so you get a lot of, internal, perhaps cognitive, meaningful, but you get a lot of power by embracing this category, and I think one of the restraining principles is, like, it's an infinite category, and because it's infinite, it's not a meaningful, like, I'm thinking, like, now mathematically, is like, infinity isn't a quantity, it's a category of unquantifiable quantities. I gotta be careful, I'm misspeaking, I'm sure, but, like, infinity is in some sense a description of quantity, but it's a description of unquantified quantities, right? It's still talking about the amount of something, but it's saying it's an unending or uncountable, or it's a quantity, it's an unbounded quantity, right? And so, in some sense, I don't want to get too deep into mathematics because what I'm about to say isn't strictly speaking true, but in some sense you can say that, like, all unbounded quantities are quantitatively equivalent, because they're not quantitatively comparable. So they all exist equally beyond quantitative comparison. Okay, Julian, focus, bring it back. What this means is that, like, God is reasonably the answer to a question like, what created the universe? God. Yeah, okay, that's a reasonable answer. But it's also a reasonable answer for, like, any other number of existential and, questions of, like, well, what's at the end of the universe? Well, God. Or what's what's in the heart of an atom? God. Well, what's, what should I, what's the purpose or meaning of my life? What should I do with my, well, God. I mean, there's just all these questions that all have, I don't want to say infinite, but that all give a kind of answer that's outside of the system of sort of rational, logical understanding. So in that sense, the word God is like, the word energy or something. Like, it can be useful to talk, like, there was something there that's outside of the rules of detailed information. Like, I can't tell you about it, but there was something, and in the case of God, as opposed to energy, you can say it's like there was something that was unbeholden to the constraints of the system, which somehow it seemed to manifest in, or something. There's some sort of transcendent property or quality. And there are all sorts of, transcendent properties and qualities of systems that we understand very well. So the idea that, transcendent properties and qualities aren't meaningful or aren't useful, it's like, of course they are, like, imagine mathematics without infinity. I mean, it would be a joke. I mean, there's all sorts of things where we're like, yeah, we need to be able to understand or be able to handle the reality of some transcendent property or quality. I mean, arguably, all the interesting, meaningful things have that, in some sense, have that transcendent, unknowable quality. I think one of the dangers is that, I think one of the pitfalls of being a religious person who, has that sort of spiritual life where they are in contact with the transcendent, is that there's this a risk, a temptation maybe, that they all sort of collapse into some unary thing, that all possible conceptions of God are the same thing. The idea that there's only one God. And, here when we talk about God, there is a dimension in which there is only one God. But then there's also dimensions in which... it's complicated. I mean... What am I biting off here? What am I getting myself into? We're almost halfway through. The arbitrary 1 hour time that I set myself. What are we talking about? We're talking about God as a cheat code. So, I think that your capacity to think, especially to certain extremes, to certain limit cases, is dramatically empowered by the inclusion of transcendent objects. Yeah, I don't know. Picking words is hard. But if we include transcendence, I think actually transcendental functions are the basis of calculus. But anyways, I'm getting distracted. Now I'm distracting myself. So anyways, that isn't necessarily the personal, historical, Judeo-Christian monotheistic God. But it's a case for, did I make this distinction in the teaser of the last episode? I think it may have been, so I may have to repeat it. If I repeated it earlier in this episode, my apologies. But I think it's important to make a distinction between types of gods, right? I think there's, not as though I'm going to reduce to 3 the infinite category of transcendence, but 3 useful, practical, common conceptions of God would be like an internal, personal God, an external God, in the physical world that individuals can't ever have any sort of, maybe not connection, but we don't have access to. So there's the external one, which may or may not exist, but either way we don't know. There's the internal one, which is the only one that really, you could argue, you have some direct access to. But then I think the one that's most interesting for me, and which is most productive to speak of, is the linguistic God. Not the external transcendent category, not the internal transcendent category, but the linguistic transcendent category. That we need to have some sort of linguistic, whether it's a placeholder or whether it's a more meaningful construct, we need to be able to talk about the transcendent, whether that's internal, external, anything. And our categories of language, the words that we have, are so limited in this regard. It's not that we can't talk about the transcendent, but it can very quickly become confusing and difficult. And who's texting me? Okay. So I think it's very difficult to make a utilitarian case for an external God. I think it's trivial to make a utilitarian case for an internal God. But what I really want to do is make a utilitarian case for a linguistic God. I think we need to talk about God. We need to talk about what the word means. Because I think one of the big problems is that everyone uses it to mean something different. So, I say, hey, I believe in the personal experience of some transcendent reality. And they say, oh my gosh, an old man in the clouds, that's so silly. It's like, that's not what I said. I said something that was profoundly true about myself. I may have accidentally said, I believe in God, because I assumed that my category of the transcendent and your category of the transcendent, it didn't occur to me that those could be so radically different. But then when you answered me presupposing some entirely different conception of what I meant. So it's like, anytime I say anything about God, it loses all meaning in the context of communicating to another person who has an entirely different category about God. Now, if we just so happen to come from the same religious background, community, practices, beliefs, whatever, then we're more likely to sort of resonate, that my speech, you're more able to hook meaning onto it in a way that you go like, oh yeah, I know what you mean, that makes sense. But especially if, one person is religious and one person isn't, and then you utter a sentence with the word God in it without very clearly defining exactly what you mean by that, well, you're just causing trouble. I mean, it's like, going to another country and then, what would be a good metaphor? And then just speaking your own language, or like, or, what's it called? Like pidgin French? The idea that like, if I want to speak French, I simply speak English with a French accent. It's like you sort of crudely try to translate into this other language, but you don't actually understand you don't actually know how they talk. You're just sort of mimicking them or something. So it's like, in order to speak about the divine, the transcendent, about God, it's like, just to say a single sentence, you're going to have to explain for like 5 minutes all the background, what you mean, what you think, because this isn't, it's like most other words have pretty agreed upon, relatively shared, consistent meanings. But some words, and especially words which fall into transcendent categories, have shockingly, extremely divergent meaning. So when you see like a debate about a religious debate about existence or non-existence of God, it's like, well, have you defined what you mean by God? Like, what is this thing that you're debating the existence or non-existence of? Like, are you even discussing the same category? Because so many of these, God, you ever see a debate? Debates are just, oh my God. It's like, has nobody in so long learned how to organize or structure a debate? What is this like, you get so much time and we just talk past each other? It's just like, we're just talking heads saying what we believe, but we're not actually like communicating with each other. Because like we'd have to, interrupt each other and clarify things and like actually work collaboratively, as opposed to just like shouting our own talking points. Because like in the religious self-consistent rhetoric, the religious attitude is correct, and it's like in the non-religious rhetoric, the non-religious attitude is correct. So if we're both just, monologuing in our own frame of reference, like, yeah, of course we're not going to make any progress or convince the other. Part of it is like you have to, in some sense, you have to have like the courage, not just the intellectual courage, but like a sort of an existential and a spiritual courage to like consider, what does this other person think and believe about the world? And only when I access and enter into their consciousness, into their cognition, and I understand, oh, this is what they're saying, this is what they mean, this is what they think, now we can have a real, sort of a productive, maybe I should say, not a real, but we can have a more productive, not even a debate, but a more productive conversation, because we're actually like speaking the same language. I know I'm kind of like trivializing this, but it's like if we're not using words to mean the same things, especially important words like God, it's like what are we even talking about? What are we just wasting our time? So, what's my prescription? What am I saying? I think if you're religious, you should show. I think if you're not religious, I think you should get into it. If you are smart, then you should be specific about what you mean. That's what I'm saying. Oh God, I'm going back into my fugue state. Yeah, I mean, if you're religious, I think you should really critically investigate your categories, what you believe, and how you would communicate. Because also, here's the other thing, is like, if you are a religious person and someone is not religious or has different religious beliefs than you, like, if you're like I mean, it depends maybe on your faith, but, if you really believe in divinity and, whatever, salvation or some supreme divine knowledge of God in whatever form, which I feel like most religions have some version of that. It's like, wouldn't you feel bad for people who don't have that? Like, wouldn't you want to share that with others? And then if I'm an atheist, or if I'm not religious or something, and I'm seeing this person who, has what to me seems, non-rational, crazy, has all these weird beliefs that I think don't make any sense and are hurting them, wouldn't I, if I cared, if I was a good person, wouldn't I want to help liberate them from those bad ideas? So it's like, the fact that, in polite society, we don't really interrogate each other's belief or non-belief in transcendent categories is like kind of weird, because the fact that transcendent categories exist is like, at some level, seems like one of the most important things. Like, by definition, I mean, maybe important is a difficult word to define here, but like, that's the most important category, is the transcendent category. Categories. Well, that's the thing. In the transcendent category, the singular transcendent category and the plural transcendent category are equivalent. That's the beauty of transcendent categories. So I think that, part of polite society is just a weariness. Weary and wary are different words. I think a weariness is what I mean to say. A weariness about, confronting your fellow citizen on something that ultimately is going to be difficult to resolve. And I think that's part of the problem, is because it's difficult to resolve, we just kind of say, well, not worth it, not going to happen, whatever. And I think even though it's difficult, what could be more important than getting on the same page spiritually, whether that means to be spiritual or to not be spiritual or whatever. To the fact that we're all living in different realities and different universes, with different gods and different categories, it's like, yeah, that kind of makes sense. if we were all living in the same world, we would all agree on the same facts, and we would be much more harmonious species. But I think the fact that we genuinely, through the faculties of the mind and categorization, we genuinely live in different universes. Not even we live in different universes. We live in different kinds of universes. You and your neighbor may, one of you lives in a divine reality, and one of you lives in a, materialistic, reductionist reality. I mean, the fact that you live in your mind, and therefore you live in different constructed ideations of reality. I mean, whoa. Reminds me of this, I think it was on The Matrix. It was some documentary about the scientific reality of the Matrix or something. And so they were interviewing university professors or something. I don't know. And they had this guy. I thought it was so silly at first, but it's one of those things that has just been kicking around in the back of my mind, and now I think about it all the time. Is part of it was just that he was on screen with this little banner saying who he is, and he's some PhD professor, and I'm thinking oh, I'm going to get this deeply profound insight into reality, and he's literally, the question is what is reality, or what makes something real, and his definition, his technical academic definition is, what was it? Reality is the set of things that tend to be the case. Which is, so poetic. So, it's got so much going for it. And yet, the set of things that tend to be the case. First of all, it completely ignores, the basis of reality. What constitutes a thing, or a set of things. So, his definition of reality is not presupposing a physical reality. It's not presupposing a certain kind of reality. And then, tend to be the case? Reality is what tends to be the case? No, surely reality is immutable. It's, it can't be argued with. God, words are so... Part of my fugue state, especially the fugue state in episode 0, but just in general. Sometimes when I was listening to episode 0, I was like, Jesus Christ, I sound like I'm on drugs. But really the challenge that I'm facing right now, which is kind of crazy that I've been thinking of this kind of stuff for so long, but I've never actually done it as a recording. Now here I am recording it. It's I've realized, oh my God, do you know how hard it is to think when you're not allowed to stop talking? If I'm going to try and fill the space, it's one thing to fill it about something that I know about or whatever, but if I'm really thinking deep and philosophizing, it's I need to pause and think. So when I'm just staring at the waveform of my voice as I talk, and the moment I pause to think, I just see it go flat. So it's I'm inducing some fugue state, some altered state of consciousness by this kind of a nervousness, when a kid goes on stage to present, and it's they can't take a breath, they have to go. That's kind of what I feel is I feel I'm kind of inducing a sort of delirium in myself by holding myself to this. I don't even know why I'm doing it, because I feel it's arguably doing more harm than good, that I just feel I have to be talking. I can't pause to think, which I could just pause to think, and then I could just cut it out. It's it's not even, you wouldn't even have to know about it. But yeah, I'm just a madman, which kind of is an interesting description of what insanity is, or what a madman would be. It's he can't turn off, and it's you don't have to give wild ideas to a person to turn them into a crazy person. All you have to do is just tell them you're not allowed to stop talking, and then in very short order they will fall apart at the seams. I wonder if there's something neurologically, the part of your brain that's talking would otherwise be used for something else, or something like that, where because you're overusing this resource, you're not giving space for it to be redistributed. I don't know. We are exactly 3/4 of the way, 75%, 15 minutes left, and in 10 minutes from now, we're going to go to our wind down and sign off segment. So we've got 10 more minutes to talk about God and conceptions of God. We were talking about God in language. We're talking about, the set of things that tend to be the case, reality, the realness of God, the utility of God. What else? Maybe we could do some practical, some functional things. We could sort of move a little bit towards the internal God. So one of the things I was talking about at the beginning of this episode or whatever was this idea of having a conversation. I forget actually what it was that I was talking about, but having a conversation within yourself and not identifying with the response. So, arguably you're talking to yourself, two areas of your brain you're talking, whatever. There's some dialogue happening inside your brain. But your experience is that one half of that conversation. I mean, arguably both halves are basically the same thing. Whatever one half is, the other half has to be the same kind of thing. Otherwise, they couldn't be talking. But one half of them, you identify, that's me. That's my voice. That's my thoughts. I'm thinking that. I'm asking that. I'm doing that. And then the other one, which is arguably, in some sense, a mirror image. It's the exact same thing. You go, that's not me. I'm not that. I didn't know that. That's surprising to me. So you have this genuine experience of internal otherness, right? Something inside of you, a voice, a character, a thing, an idea, a thought, whatever, that you don't identify with, that even you identify as foreign, which has integrity, which has maybe a cohesiveness, a life, which can answer and which can be interrogated. And we were talking about the puzzling mindset, and one of those things is just like a certain set of answers where, like, I invoke my internal divinity by asking impossible questions. And then this puzzling part of my brain just goes, well, to answer that impossible question, I would need to invoke some transcendent quantity. And so that, to me, is like the internal manifestation of divinity. And it's, like, so useful. It's so functional. Because otherwise you just can't think, right? You just can't, I can't think in that direction because it doesn't make any sense. Like, there's no answer. It's just a brick wall. But then you're like, well, what if I just suppose that it could be? What if I just suppose some transcendent quantity? And then, I can just walk through the wall. Now, it's not my physical body walking through the wall, right? My physical body is restrained by the physical wall. But the subtle body, the conceptual body, the what if, the hypothetical, the divinely invoked, the transcendent body, the transcendent self, can continue on and explore that. And sometimes what's arguably surprising, if this sounds like nonsense to you, is that once you've done that and you've let go of the impossibility of it, you discover, there's actually things I didn't know about this because I hadn't let myself go this far. That actually, now that I'm in it, now that I'm inside, there's actually all sorts of ingress points where I could make the transition. And then you could, staying in the metaphor, return to your body and then go find those ingress holes. So, like, it's a cheat code, right? It's sort of what happens in the scientific method is, like, this thing is outside of our current understanding. So what's the minimum I would need to change about our current understanding to make this, sensible? And it works. We discover new models of reality by doing that. And I think it's also very, very, undoubtedly very useful just at a personal level, like, emotionally. And that's maybe one of the things which is most interesting, is that when we're having external communication, it's mediated by language. But when we have internal communication, it's mediated by, like a neural language, right? An internal language, which is, when we talk about cheat codes, we're talking about cheat codes, as meaningful within a system. Well, the system of your brain communicating it to yourself also has cheat codes, and those cheat codes are, we could say, are in a transcendent category. So the internal, the God of the mind, lets you,
completely re-architecture your own mind, essentially at will, in some respects, which is totally outside the realm of possibility if you don't engage with that concept of transcendent categories, right? So what happens is that people without access to this sort of transcendent category are like completely blocked down mentally. And I think we see this, like, I don't want to get too far here, we're nearing the end, but like culturally we see this where people are just like, that can't be, that couldn't happen, like they just are not willing to accept. And it's like, yeah, of course it could, you just don't want to think about it. Like it doesn't follow your own internal rules and constraints, but that doesn't mean that it can't happen. There's people all over the world who live like that. You just can't fathom it. You just can't wrap your mind around it. So that's, maybe that's the real art in all this, is mind wrapping. How do you stretch and flex your mind to be able to hold onto something that you thought was, holding an idea that you thought couldn't be held. Even wrong ideas, even bad ideas can be held. So I think there's a lot of utility in God. And then I think that maybe this is what we can do the last 3 minutes, is like, there's this sense of like, well, okay, sure, provisionally, fine, it's useful, utilitarian, whatever. But come on, and again, these are the non-believers, so to speak. They're saying, yeah, okay, so fine, you can use it as a tool, but it's not real in an existential sense. It's not. But to me, it's like, well, what do you mean real? What do you mean real in an existential sense? It's like, if it exists in your mind, if it's part of your daily life, if it's a tool you're using, how is that not real? Like, what does it even mean to think about realness? It's like, well, it's, that's just some silly tool that you're using. It's just a hack. It's just a cheat code. It's not real. It's like, well, we're built on hacks. We're built on cheat codes. Technology is hacks. God is a technology. It's among other things, it's a psychological, it's a cognitive technology of how to, and so I think there is a sort of a fundamental divinity, because there's a fundamental transcendent category within the architecture of the mind, if not the brain. So I don't think it's meaningful to interrogate it in some, then perform a miracle. It's like, I am performing a miracle. I'm thinking about the impossible. Is that not reason enough? Is that not miracle enough to invoke a little bit of fantasy? And I don't mean fantasy in a derogatory term or to denigrate it, but it's, can I invoke the universe within me? We live in this liminal, on this nexus between the internal and the out. The internal and the outternal. The internal and the outternal world. Oh, we are nearing the end. It's about that time. And so we have to have tools. We have to be able to navigate in both, right? Of course, we want to, like, it's interesting is there's this paradox of like, well, is the external world the quote-unquote real world? But we don't live we live in our own minds. We live in our own projection and hallucination of the external world. So is the internal world the quote-unquote real world? Is one preeminent? Like, both have dimensions in which they're preeminent to the other, but they're both interrelated. They're not separate. The internal world and the external world are not separate. They're just two ends of a balance, and the fulcrum of the self sort of lies in between them. Anyways, we are at that point. It is time to begin the wind down and sign off segment. So let us wind down from big ideas of transcendent categories, and let us return to our ciscendent categories. God damn it, Julian, just stop it. Um, just okay. Be normal. Um, we're winding down. Winding down. We're breathing, we're thinking, we're moving. Teaser. What are we talking about next? Did we have a thing that we wanted to, that came up, that called to us for next time? Maybe we don't have a teaser. I don't know yet. Maybe I'll have to decide what next time is going to be. There's like, housekeeping. There's how this went and what's going on and what's happening and what it will be, and maybe we need a meta category of like, how do I pick the topics and the categories. Also, like, I feel like if we're just gonna be talking about it now, it's like we should pick simple things. Like if we're picking deep, profound subjects, it's like we're not gonna have enough time to like say much about them. I mean, I feel like these first few, we're just dating. We're just getting to know each other. We're just feeling each other out. We don't have to commit to big. I don't have to run for president. I don't have to take over the world or save the universe, or we can just take our time, warm up, see how things go, get some feedback, do a little dance. Yeah. So God, yeah. That's God for today. Maybe we should end with a prayer. We should say, God, what is it? God, our Heavenly Father, forgive us our trespass. Okay, so it'd be like, God, our transcendent category, forgive us our delineations as we forgive those who discriminate between our categories. Right? Something funny joke. I take the thing and then make it the transformation process, and then it applies to the thing. It's like funny. This is the difference between planning and scripting and thinking in advance and then just sounding confident, and what I'm doing, which is just, we winging it, baby. Maybe that's a good title. Winging it. Because metaphor, to wing, as a human, to wing is like angelic, demons, devil, demons. The devil and demons are fallen angels, according to, I think, Christian esoteric mysticism. So, to be winged is neutral. We don't know. Are you good winged? Are you an angel? Are you bad winged? Are you a demon? The devil himself. Does the devil have wings? He's got horns. He should have wings. He does have wings, I think. In most depictions, the devil has wings, right? He's an angel. So, we did it. We got uno minuto. 1 minute. We are signing off. Why? Why not sign off now at the natural point conclusion? Why drag it on? Maybe I just like hearing myself talk, huh? You're the one listening, so I guess you like hearing me talk too. So, whose fault is it anyway? Yeah, I think that's all that needs to be said about God. I think we've solved the universe's problems. I think there shall never again be a debate about, what are we talking about? God? Whatever. It's over. We did it. I solved it. I'm so conclusively, all the questions, boom, done. We did it. Never need to revisit this issue again. It's solved. Everybody agrees with me. No comments, no questions, no criticisms. Everything I said was perfecto. So, if I get feedback, then we'll revisit it. But until then, we are done. We're out, and I will decide what the subject of our next episode is going to be. So thanks again for coming along for this crazy ride, and I will see you next time. Cheers.